Well, hello. So glad we get to continue our study of the Messianic Prophecies of the Old Testament as we continue looking at how the prophets build up the case for the Messianic kingdom and the coming of the Christ Jesus of Nazareth. Got the chance to look last time at the book of Ezekiel, kind of the last of the major prophets as he lays the case for the restoration of the temple through the new creation as he sees the coming of the shepherd king who will lead Israel back into a proper relationship with the Lord. Today we're going to look at a prophet who is difficult. There's just no other way to put it. The book Daniel is often listed in our writings as one of the major prophets. He is and he isn't. Obviously, there's a lot about Daniel that is prophetic, particularly the last 6 chapters. But Daniel is also considered in the Hebrew scriptures to be one of the writings. And so he was actually kind of considered to be a different category than those of the big prophets considered to be Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Isaiah, and then what we often consider the minor prophets, which were also called the 12. And so Daniel is kind of different than all of those. He's really not considered to be in the Hebrew scriptures one of the prophets. He's considered to be part of this wisdom literature, Ecclesiastes, Job, Psalm, Proverbs, Ruth, all this kind of other writings. And part of that is because Daniel's prophecy is explicitly apocalyptic. And we talked about that vision of, or that idea of an apocalypse being a vision, kind of that veil being lifted back off of the human eyes to be able to see some of the goings on of heaven. And Daniel is very dense with prophetic imagery. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a couple of, I think, probably the easier passages in Daniel to see clear messianic tones, and then we're going to kind of do a fairly broad overview of the final 6 chapters, because I think the final 6 chapters of Daniel are probably some of the most abused apocalyptic scriptures. There's a lot of numbers that are thrown out, 70 weeks and 7 plus 62 weeks and 12 60 days and 13 35 days, and people have tried to parse out this code of what that talks about, and what year does this mean the Lord is coming back, and I think that's completely ignoring what Daniel was actually written about. So what we want to do is we want to put Daniel into the overall context of the Messianic prophecies. What is the book of Daniel trying to tell us about the coming of the Messianic kingdom? So let's go ahead and start in Daniel chapter 2. As we talked about when we looked at Daniel, the first 6 chapters of Daniel are fairly straightforward. These are kind of the more narrative sections of the book, telling the stories of Daniel and his 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We talked about how Daniel and his 3 friends come to Babylon. They are made officials in the kingdom. They are taught the language, taught the customs, and basically turned into royal officials in the court of King Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 2 is where we have the famous story of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, where he has this dream. It troubles him. He gets all of his magicians together. He's like, okay, tell me what this dream means. They're like, okay, sure, tell us what the dream is. He's like, no, you have to tell me what the dream was and its interpretation. Otherwise, I'm going to kill all of you. Of course, all the magicians can't do that. They freak out, but they remember that this one guy, Daniel, is supposedly able to understand these types of things and has a whole lot of wisdom. So they ask for Daniel, and Daniel comes and relays the dream. So we're going to take a look in Daniel chapter 2 in verse 31. And Daniel says, "You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you. Its appearance was awesome. The head of that statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." We've talked a lot about this particular passage. It's an important one in the overall narrative of Daniel. Daniel then proceeds to interpret what these things mean. He says that the gold head is Babylon. The silver, the bronze, the iron, and the clay are all subsequent kingdoms that are going to arise after these things, and kind of gives us a fairly clear picture that it's Medo-Persia, Greece, and then Rome. And then during the time of Rome, there's going to be this big stone that comes. And in verse 44, it says, "In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. And that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever. Inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So the dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy." Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, did homage to Daniel, and gave orders to present to him an offering and fragrant incense. The king answered Daniel and said, "Surely your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery." And so this is, again, one of the very famous passages of Daniel, and it's pretty clear in its messianic interpretations, particularly given the New Testament context, that these, great powerful kingdoms of Babylon, Persia, Alexander the Great, and then Rome, they are all swept aside by the kingdom of God, by this messianic kingdom that comes. It's a stone cut without hands that's kind of bearing images of the altars that Israel would build. They were always supposed to be stones cut without hands. They were made just of natural rocks. And so this is just like a big, massive altar stone coming from heaven. It comes up, and it's a mountain that spreads over all the earth. And so it's not just another kingdom. It is the final kingdom. It is the kingdom that destroys all other kingdoms. And this is an important aspect that Daniel brings out about the Messianic kingdom that we've seen alluded to in others, particularly Ezekiel with the Gog and Magog imagery. Daniel makes it clear that the Messianic kingdom is not just coming for salvation of the Jews. It's not just coming for the good things of people. It is also coming to put an end to the wicked kingdoms of the world. It is coming to defeat not just the wicked kingdoms, but the spiritual powers behind those wicked kingdoms. And I think that's sometimes an aspect of the Messianic kingdom we maybe downplay or we don't give as much credit for. But that's a big part of Jesus' kingdom. We talked about this in the Miracles of Jesus videos, that Jesus came to disarm the powers and authorities of this world, the spiritual forces of darkness. He came as a conquering warrior to completely destroy them. And so his death on the cross disarmed them of their most powerful weapon. And so when he comes for the final time, comes to finally win the war against Satan, it will be no contest. He has already disarmed them. He has already guaranteed his victory. And so when this mountain comes for the final time and comes to crush not just Rome, but all of the descendants of Rome, all of the types of Rome that have existed, that kingdom is coming for a final time, and it will establish a true kingdom of justice and mercy and peace. And so that's a big theme in Daniel, is that God is not only behind the workings of these nations, and he's not just the power in charge of their rise and fall, he's also setting them up for destruction, that he's going to come and his kingdom is ultimately going to eradicate these terrible regimes and ultimately overthrow them in favor of this Messianic kingdom that, as we're going to see, is going to be ruled by this archetypal Messianic prince. We then get in chapter 3. This is not so much a Messianic prophecy, but I always think these are really cool to highlight here. Daniel chapter 3 is the famous story of Daniel's three friends and the golden image of Nebuchadnezzar. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah refuse to bow down to this idol of Nebuchadnezzar. They are thrown into the fiery furnace after they give this, great denouncement of Nebuchadnezzar that, we will not bow to your statue even if it kills us. And so as they are thrown up into the fire, it says in verse 24 of chapter 3 that Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up in haste. He said to his high officials, "Was it not 3 men we cast bound into the midst of the fire?" They replied to the king, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire. He responded and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God, and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. The satraps, the prefects, the governors, the king's high officials gathered around and saw in regard to these men that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, nor was the hair of their heads singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command, and yielded up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God." And so this is, I think, one of these really interesting appearances, and I think this is what is often called a Christophany. We've talked about these in some occasions where these are, I think, pre-incarnation's appearance of Jesus. These are very similar to passages like Joshua 5:13 through 15, where the commander of the armies of the Lord appears. It's similar, I think, to the appearances of the messenger of the Lord, the angel of the Lord that's described in Genesis that appears to Abraham. It appears to Hagar. In a couple of instances, it's probably the one that wrestles with Jacob, becoming Israel. And so we've talked about these before, that these are likely Old Testament appearances of Christ before the incarnation of him as a human. And the description of Nebuchadnezzar seeing him as a son of the gods definitely implies this is at the very least an angelic being. But I think given the propensity of the Old Testament to do these things, and particularly the connections that are later going to be made with sun imagery, I think this is a Christophany. I think this would be literally the Christ coming to protect these men, shielding them from for their faith from the effects of the fire, so much so that they don't even smell like smoke. And so again, I think this is just those are always cool to me to point out. I think they're just really neat stories, and it shows how God has been active in the story, and I think even the Son has been active in the story even before his manifestation as Jesus. So the rest of the story proceeds afoot. We know that the Babylonian Empire falls under Belteshazzar. The Persian Empire rises up. You have King Darius and the episode of the Lion's Den. And then you have, in chapter 7, the transition to these images. And so the one that we're really going to focus on is the one in Daniel 7, which actually takes place in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. So this is actually before the events of chapter 6. This is, I think, probably the most important of the images for our purposes, for Messianic purposes. Because what's going to happen in Daniel 9 is that Daniel is going to offer this really profound prayer where he notes that the 70-year period of exile that Jeremiah had prophesied is almost done. And so he's reflecting on these things, and he actually offers this really impressive prayer of repentance. Even though he himself has not been part of the sins of Israel, he offers kind of a national prayer of repentance, recognizes the harm that Israel has done, and begs for forgiveness. And so almost kind of in response to this, what we're going to see is that there's this vision that's going to take place. I said that, and I think I actually just completely swapped places. I did. So I jumped way ahead of myself. That's going to be in Daniel chapter 9. I totally just messed that up. Daniel chapter 9, let's just go ahead and look over there now, just so, because I've already kind of given the introduction here. And we'll go back to Daniel 7. So Daniel 9 is actually the first year of Darius, so it's during the time period of chapter 6. But Daniel chapter 9 is where he offers this prayer. And so there's then this vision that he has of Gabriel, this messenger angel, who's actually kind of bringing an answer to that prayer. And so in verse 20, after Daniel's offered the prayer, it says, "Now while I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, presenting my supplication before the Lord my God in behalf of the holy mountain of my God, while I was still speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in my vision previously, came to me in my extreme weariness about the time of the evening offering. He gave me instructions and talked with me and said, 'O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you insight with understanding. At the beginning of your supplications, the command was issued, and I have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed, so give heed to the message and gain understanding of the vision. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the Prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined, and he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. Okay. There's a lot of dense prophetic imagery in Daniel chapter 9, verse 24 through 27. You've got this term Messiah. Now, Messiah is a very loaded term, but Messiah, very simply translated, means anointed one. So I'm really actually not going to offer much of an opinion on this, more of just kind of an informative thing. There are 2 interpretations that you can go with this. One is that the 70 weeks that's being referred to here, which is really then broken into actually kind of a second period of after the 70 weeks, there's going to be this period of like 7 weeks and then 62 weeks, 32 weeks. And so you get this period of turmoil. And there's this anointed one, and there's abomination, and all these things. And I think we rush into thinking that this is a Christophanic prophecy, that this is a prophecy about Jesus. I think this is actually related more to the prophecies of chapter 10 through 12. Chapter 10 through 12 talks about kind of this in-between time period that, again, with the benefit of history, we know is in between the Persian Empire and the rise of Christ. And there's this period of about 400, 500 years, about 490 total, where there's a lot of turmoil and tension. And so more than likely this kind of vague prophecy in chapter 9, it's kind of an introduction to what's talked about in 10 through 12, which is this in-between time period, and it really focuses on the turmoil that's going to happen for the Jews under the time period of Antiochus Epiphanes, who is one of the successor kings to the kingdoms that break up after Alexander the Great's empire overtakes Persia, and then Alexander the Great dies. Then you've got these 4 successor kingdoms. Antiochus Epiphanes is one of those kings, and he is very oppressive to the Jews. And so chapter 10 through 12 gives a really detailed breakdown of all of those issues, and prophetically is talking about what's going to happen. And the purpose of all of this, I think, is for the people of Israel to be given comfort in the midst of those afflictions. That Daniel's basically getting kind of a preview of what's going to take place before the Messianic kingdom. And so I think, and again, there's a lot of dense imagery in here that really can't be explained in just a 30-minute class. But I don't think this is a particularly messianic prophecy. I think the anointed one is actually more talking about some of the priestly systems that are going on here. I don't think this is specifically about Jesus. Part of the main reason I think about this is that Daniel 9's never cited in the New Testament, and it never comes up as like proof of like, oh, hey, remember how Daniel said this, and this was going to happen? Here's where we get this, here's the 7 weeks, here's the 62 weeks. That doesn't take place. And it's really never used in the New Testament as proof or a citation of the messiahship of Jesus. And if it was, you would think that would be kind of a slam dunk case for it. And so I think the prophecies of Daniel 9 through 12 are more about that intertestamental period, more so than foreshadowing the coming of the king. Now, they are also foreshadowing, and I think give comfort to us as Christians, because it shows the hand of God in the midst of those time periods. And Revelation is going to use some of the images of Daniel 9 through 12 and kind of broaden them in their application so that kind of all Christians can find comfort that anyone who sets himself up as, this opponent to God is ultimately going to be humbled. But I think for Christians today, using Daniel 9 through 12 and trying to treat it as like this, hidden cipher code, I don't think makes sense. I don't think that is the appropriate use of Daniel 9 through 12. I think it is more giving a broad hope to people in times of persecution and times of oppression, particularly by world powers, to remember what God has said about these world powers, that all of this statue is going to be crushed by the coming of the Messianic kingdom, and all of these terrible kings that are going to oppress God's people, they're ultimately going to collapse and ultimately be swept away by the coming of the Messianic kingdom. So I think Daniel 9 through 12 is more about the coming of the Messianic kingdom and kind of that in-between period more than the actual kingdom. Now, in the contrast to that, which is what I meant to say first, Daniel 7, I think, is heavily Messianic. And so this is where we want to kind of wrap things up. And so originally I was going to talk about Daniel 7, but then I gave that whole introduction to Daniel 9. So now we're going to get into Daniel 7. So Daniel 7, as I had said first, is in the first year of Belshazzar, the king of Babylon. And Daniel has this vision of these four beasts that arise out of the earth. And again, these beasts were explicitly told represent various kingdoms. And the later part of Daniel 7, 15 through 28 interprets kind of what these beasts are and what they're going to be. But what's important for us is that in verse 9, after these four beasts come out and they're terrifying and they're filled with horns and teeth and all these terrible things, Daniel says, I kept looking until thrones were set up and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His vesture was like white snow and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was ablaze with flames. Its wheels were a burning fire. The river of fire was flowing and coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands were attending him, and myriads upon myriads were standing before him. The court sat and the books were opened. Then I kept looking because of the sound of the boastful words which the horn was speaking. This is kind of one of the beasts that has been talking about. I kept looking until the beast was slain, its body was destroyed, and given to the burning fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but an extension of life was granted to them for an appointed period of time. I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days, was presented before him, and to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. So, probably the biggest thing that jumps out right there is that descriptive phrase, the Son of Man. So you have these two figures. You have the Ancient of Days who destroys these beasts, destroys the fourth terrible one completely, and kind of sets a time period where the other three will be destroyed. And then the Ancient of Days, who is, this white, fiery figure seated upon the throne, very similar to Ezekiel language, we might notice, of the theophany in chapter 1. He then gives authority to the Son of Man, who comes, the second figure who basically comes in and is given dominion and kingship and honor by the Ancient of Days. Now, that terminology, the Son of Man, is really important because, as we might remember from our Miracles of Jesus class, that's the description that Jesus most often uses of himself, as Son of Man. Now, sometimes that phrase, Son of Man, just simply means literally a son of man, just a human being. Ezekiel himself is often called a Son of Man. But it's clear that Jesus is partly using this imagery of the Son of Man from Daniel. In fact, in his trial, before the Sanhedrin, they're going to ask him, who are you? And he's going to say, you're going to see the Son of Man descending upon the clouds, which we see that phraseology used here in Daniel 7, That's a clear messianic claim. Jesus is basically saying, hey, I am the Son of Man that Daniel was talking about, the Messiah who's going to receive the kingdoms. So this is a very clear messianic claim. And in fact, later in the chapter, in verse 21, it makes it clear, I kept looking, and that horn was waging war with the saints and overpowering them until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was passed in favor of the saints of the highest one, and the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom. And then later in verse 26, it says, the court will sit for judgment, and his dominion will be taken away, annihilated, and destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, the dominion, and the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all the dominions will serve and obey him. And so this is kind of what links the entire book of Daniel together, is that this kingdom, the Messianic kingdom that comes and shatters the statue of Nebuchadnezzar, this kingdom is going to be ruled by this Son of Man, who has, again, the name implies humanity, but it's also clear that he's before the Ancient of Days. He's in this heavenly realm. He's being seen in the apocalyptic vision. So he's got ties both to the earthly realm and to the heavenly realm. The Ancient of Days imbues him with authority, and then he rules alongside the saints of the highest one. And so, this Messianic king is being presented to us that he's the one who ultimately is going to overthrow with the power of the Ancient of Days. He's going to overthrow all of these beasts, these nations, and ultimately he's going to be the one to establish dominion forever. And so what I think Daniel adds to the whole idea of the Messianic prophecies is that he shows us that the coming Messianic kingdom is not merely a spiritual kingdom. There is a component of the kingdom that is coming to overthrow the wicked, physical, earthly nations that reign as these terrible beasts, the goats and the rams and the terrible beast of Rome. And John applies these images in his revelation that all of the nations are under this control. And ultimately, John kind of further clarifies that it's Satan who's behind all of these kingdoms. And so when the Son of Man comes, he's coming to destroy the kingdoms. He's coming to destroy the power behind the kingdoms. And ultimately, his kingdom is going to reign unopposed. And he's going to gain victory through that. Now, we know, as benefits of people with the New Testament knowledge, the way that occurs is very surprising. And this is how all of these Messianic prophecies tie together, where Isaiah tells us that this victory is going to come through suffering, through death even. And so all of these different prophets are kind of bringing different perspective. Ezekiel is showing that this shepherd king is going to basically bring back the temple, is going to bring the dwelling place of God. Daniel's showing that he's coming to destroy the powerful nations of the world. He's coming to disarm the rulers and the authorities. Jeremiah is showing that he's coming to renew the covenant with the people. He's coming to change the broken hearts and the hard hearts of Israel. Isaiah is showing that he's coming to suffer. He's coming to serve the Lord and ultimately come as a king, but also as a servant. And so all of these different images, and the minor prophets add their bits as well, all of this is then revealed, and the mystery is made clear in the person of Jesus Christ himself. And so all of these different little portrayals are all adding to the picture, but you can understand how somebody who's reading all of these in pieces is like, man, who is this Son of Man and the suffering servant and the king and all these things? You could see how all of these different portrayals, we think, oh, well, yeah, of course it's Jesus. But somebody who doesn't have Jesus yet is like, man, what is going on with all of this? And so we can understand perhaps sympathize more with why these Messianic prophecies so confounded people. And unfortunately, the reality is that confusion, for some people, it led them to trust Jesus because he was able to explain them. And unfortunately, the hard hearts of others led them to deny him because they were like, well, this can't be it because we've got a different expectation of who the Messiah is going to be. So that gives you, like I said, there's a lot more that we could dive into with that. And again, I don't want to get caught in the weeds of chapter 9 through 12 because there's a lot of imagery that I think it can be really beneficial to study, but you got to really dedicate some time to it. But the overall picture of Daniel is that the Messiah is coming. He is coming to disarm all of these powers, and his kingdom that he establishes will never be overthrown. Thank you so much for taking the time to study the book of Daniel. Again, it's really dense imagery, and it's certainly tough to parse out sometimes, but the overall picture, I think, is one that is pretty clear to understand, that God is in charge, God is ruling still, and that the Son of Man has come and is coming to rule as well. Thank you so much for taking the time to study through these things. We're going to wrap this series up with probably 2 more lessons on the minor prophets. Going to look at some of the post-exilic prophets, look at how they kind of add their descriptions to this, add some clarification on how these things are going to come as well, what this Messianic kingdom is going to look like. Thank you so much for tuning in. We appreciate everybody's interest in this, and we pray that it continues to be edifying and beneficial to those of you who study it with us. Thank you so much. We'll see you again next time.